So this is a video on essay 610. The name of the essay is Using the Work of Internal Auditor. See, this particular essay is going to be applied when, as per essay 315. I've already made a video on essay 315. If you want to watch, you may watch my video on that as well. As per essay 315, identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. We are assessing the risk of material misstatement. How we are assessing this risk? By understanding the entity and its environment. We are obtaining an understanding of entity and its environment. In this essay, I said that this essay deals with understanding the entity and its environment, including internal control. So when you are obtaining an understanding of internal controls, and you find out that the internal audit function are going to be relevant to the audit you are performing, because you are not the internal auditor as far as this essay is concerned. You are an external auditor. So we will be learning this essay from an external auditor's point of view. So as an external auditor, when you obtained an understanding of the internal control, you found out that it is going to be relevant to your audit. Only in that case you will come to essay 610, which is using the work of internal auditor, because now you're using the work because you find out that it is relevant to the audit. So before coming to scope and what this essay is all about, we first need to know about what an internal audit function is and what an internal auditor is. See, these are two definitions of the internal audit function and internal auditor. First of all, it is internal audit function. Internal audit function is an appraisal activity. I've written down some of the points, but more of the points I will be writing down and explaining. Everything I will be explaining in detail, but the simpler ones I have already written down. See, internal audit function is an appraisal activity. Appraisal means that you are evaluating something. You're evaluating the performance, etc. So it is an appraisal activity that is provided as a service to the entity. Entity is going to be our client. We are an external auditor, and there would be our client. The client would be entity. Appraisal activity provided as a service to the entity. This is being provided as a service to the entity. By whom? The internal auditor. Now the function is that it is one of the activity. This is, you can say, an example of internal audit function. It includes examining the adequacy and effectiveness of internal control. That is, you are examining that internal control is adequate, it is effective. Internal audit जो आप कर रहे हैं, internal control, वो adequate है and effective है. This is what we are going to do in this internal audit as an internal audit function. So if we are going to examine this internal control, and the one who examines this is known as internal auditor. So we can say that individuals who perform the activities of internal audit function are known as internal auditor. So these are just two definitions. You must be having an understanding of these two before starting off with this essay. So this was an activity which is provided as a service, and basically what it includes is that you are examining the internal control. You are examining the effectiveness of internal control, whether it is effective or not, whether it is adequate or not. This is all about internal audit function, and the one who performs this is known as internal auditor. So now, hoping that you have now a good understanding of internal audit function and internal auditor, we can start off with this essay. First of all, we have scope of this standard on auditing. This essay basically deals with the auditor's responsibility. Which auditor? The external auditor. External auditor in this case is you and me. We are going to learn this essay from the point of view of an external auditor. This essay deals with external auditor's responsibility regarding the work of internal auditor. Whatever the internal auditor has done, we are going to examine our responsibility with respect to that. That is, whether it is required to be used, whether we should use the work which the internal auditor has already performed, etc. So this essay deals with external auditor. I'll be using this as an abbreviation of external auditor. Deals with external auditor's responsibility regarding the work of internal auditor. So straight away I've written down here. So this essay deals with external auditor's responsibility regarding the work of internal auditor. But this essay will come into force, as I have already told you, as per essay 315. That is, when the external auditor has determined that in accordance with essay 315, that internal audit function is likely to be relevant to the audit. He has already performed what is required as per essay 315, and internal audit function is going to be relevant to the audit with what the external auditor feels. Now, non-applicability of this essay. So there are two non-applicability. The first thing is that when the internal auditor is directly providing assistance to the external auditor, in this case, there could be a loss of independence, as far as we can say, because when the internal auditor himself is providing assistance to the external auditor, there cannot be any kind of differences, if because they two are those two are operating combinedly, we can say their views will be similar, because they're doing the work at the same platform. So when the internal auditor is directly assisting the auditor, this essay won't be applicable. So internal, for first instance where this essay won't be applicable is internal auditor directly assists external auditor. This is the first case. And the second case is that as per the law, as per the relevant law, we can say, as per the relevant law, the internal auditor is not allowed to show his working papers. Whatever he has done, the internal auditor is not, you can say, not, just a second. Yeah, the internal auditor is not permissible, or it is not possible as per the law for internal auditor to show his working papers or work to external auditor. So we can write that as per the law, it is not possible or permissible for the internal auditor to show his working papers to the third party. This is third party. See, as far as an internal auditor is concerned, even the external auditor is a third party for him. So if the law says that the internal auditor cannot show his working papers or provide access to the working papers to any third party, even in external auditor will be included in the third party. So we can say even the external auditor won't be having an access to the working papers. So these are the two cases or instances where this SA 610 will not be applicable, right? So now we are on to the relationship between what the internal audit function and the external auditor. See, the role and objective of the internal audit function is, before starting of this, I can just say from the practical point of view, if you are in your IPCC, or if you are preparing for any kind of interview and all, this is one of the questions which is always asked, and was asked by me from me as well. What is the difference between internal auditor and external audit function? And most of my friends and everyone I've been talking to, this is one of the common questions, that what is the difference between is the difference between internal auditor and external auditor? What is the difference between the work they perform? Although the complete won't be covered in this particular video, because this is just from the point of view of SA 610, but still I would recommend you to be prepared for such questions. So the role and objective of an internal audit function is determined by the management. Management decides what the internal auditor has to do, or those charged with governance. As far as internal audit function and external auditor is concerned, their objectives are different. This is for sure. Their objectives will be different. Just telling you, although this is not covered in your SA 610, the internal auditor provides guidance to the management, that what you have to do, how can you improve your performance, how can you reduce your costs, or improve your time efficiency, etc. and these kind of things. He provides recommendations, but statutory auditor is responsible directly to the shareholders. He is responsible for the opinion he's expressing in his audit report. He's answerable to the shareholders, while the internal auditor is not going to be related to the shareholders. He's linked with the management or those charged with governance. So their objectives are different, but some of the ways of achieving their objectives might be similar. Right. So their objectives, as I said, are different, but some of the ways in which the internal audit function and the external auditor achieve their these objectives might be similar. Right. Now we are on to the independent of entity. This is a small point, although not a separate topic. The internal audit function. See, irrespective of your the autonomy of the internal audit, autonomy basically means the independence of the entity. So we can say that internal audit function is not obviously internal audit function is not independent of the entity. Why? Because it is the management and those charged with governance which is providing him the would be his role or objective, etc. So it can never be independent of the entity, while external auditor has to be independent of the entity while expressing an opinion on the financial statements. So external auditor has to be when has to be independent when expressing an opinion on the financial statements. So the external auditor has to be independent, while the internal auditor cannot be independent of the entity. Now we have the responsibility of the audit opinion expressed. In this case, the external auditor is solely responsible for the audited opinion expressed. His responsibility is not going to be reduced because he's using the work of internal auditor. He's the only person is going to be responsible. And even in my next video, I'll be making a video on say 620. In that video as well, it is going to be about auditors use of working of auditors expert. In that case as well, his opinion is not going to, or his responsibility for the opinion is not going to be reduced by using the auditor's expert's work. On a similar note, if he's using the work of internal auditor, his responsibility is not going to be reduced. So the external auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion expressed. This responsibility is not reduced by use of internal auditor's work. Right? If he's using the work of internal auditor, his responsibility is never going to be reduced. Now, coming on to the major portion of this essay, which is what is the objectives of external auditor. We are not concerned with the internal auditor. We are talking about what is going to be the objective of external auditor. There are two objectives. The first one is whether and to what extent to use specific work of internal auditor. This is IA Rizwar is internal auditor. Now, the first objective is whether he should use the work of internal auditor, and if he says that he has to use the work of internal auditor, to what extent, that is the limit or the scope of the work he's using, the extent, basically extent is to what extent or to what depth of work he is going to be using as far as an external auditor is concerned. This is the first objective, and then in the second objective is going to decide that whether the work he is using is adequate for the purpose of audit, because he's going to perform external audit. And when he's performing external auditor, whether the work of internal auditor is going to be adequate, then he's going to decide the adequacy. And for both of these, we'll be having a discussion. So if so, that is, if yes, he has to use, and to what extent. So if yes means that he has to use the work of the internal auditor. Then he has to decide whether such work is adequate for the purpose of the audit. Audit means your external audit. Whether it is going to be adequate for the purpose of audit. Now, these two definitions I've already covered in the starting of the video regarding internal audit function and internal auditor. Now, moving on to the objective, determining the first thing, determining whether to work, whether and to what extent to use the work of internal auditor. One of the function objectives. See. Whether and to what extent to use. The second, we'll be discussing about this specific work. As of now, we are concerned with the whether and to what extent to use the work of your auditor. So, determining whether and to what extent to use the work of internal auditor. So first of all, this thing before I need to tell you that this needs to be documented. The adequacy of the work of internal auditor has to be documented. You must be remembering that if you have watched my other videos, you must be knowing that at the end of every essay we have to document things. So this is one of the things which we are going to document. The auditor is going to document. So the first thing, the external auditor shall determine whether the work of internal auditor is likely to be adequate for the purpose of audit. So this thing, another objective, whether such work is going to be adequate for the purpose of audit. So then this thing, the auditor has to determine whether he is going to whether the work is going to be adequate for the purpose of audit. And this how to determine, we'll be discussing it right now. So first thing, if the auditor determines that the internal audit, the work of internal auditor is going to be adequate for the purpose of audit, that is if answer is yes, that it is going to be relevant, then he has to determine that he has to determine the planned effect of the work of internal auditor on the nature, timing and extent of the external auditor procedures. That is, if the work is adequate, the internal auditor work is likely to be adequate for the purpose of audit, then we are going to determine the effects of the work of internal auditor on our nature, timing and extent of our procedure, what the external auditor is going to do, what effect the work of internal auditor is going to have on the nature of our work, the timing of our work and the extent of our work, right? So this is what the auditor has to determine, these two things. Now, how to determine these? How to determine that whether the work of internal auditor is likely to be adequate for the purpose of audit, whether it is adequate or not. How can we determine this? For this, the auditor shall evaluate 4 things. The first thing he has to, this is the internal auditor and this is an external auditor, right? This is the brain of internal auditor. It should be objectivity. Objectivity means honesty. He's not biased. So first of all, the external auditor has to determine whether the internal auditor is objective. So he has to determine the objectivity. Then he has to determine the technical competence. She should be having a technical competence. That is, he should have knowledge of maybe accounting standards, auditing standards, the financial statements, various provisions of law, rules, and regulations, etc. He should have some technical knowledge. Then the work carried out by this internal auditor is with due professional care. Taking due care while performing the work, professional care. And then there should be effective communication between internal auditor and external auditor. Whether there is effective communication or not, this is what the external auditor is going to evaluate for determining whether the work is going to be adequate or not, right? Giving you a simple example, if he is not having a technical competence, or is not giving a knowledge of accounting standards or standards on auditing, these are basic examples. Then we could basically infer from this that the work won't be adequate. Now, if we have inferred that the work is going to be adequate, then what we do is that we examine the planned effect. The auditor determine the effects of the work of the internal auditor on our nature, timing, and extent of our procedures. Now, how to determine the effect? And the auditor has to consider three things in this. The first thing is he shall consider the nature and scope of the work performed by internal auditor. He's going to consider the work and scope of the nature and scope of the work which the internal auditor has already performed. Then he shall consider the assessed risk of material misstatement. He shall consider this assessed risk of material misstatement. Then the degree of subjectivity. Subjectivity means this is subjectivity. Subjectivity means that the internal auditor is using his own beliefs, his experience, his perspective. So it is basically the opposite of objectivity. Objectivity is not influenced by personal bias, etc. But subjectivity is you're using is it is having an impact of personal perspective, personal beliefs, etc. So the more is subjectivity, it is bad for the assessment, we can say. So the degree of subjectivity involved in evaluation of the audit evidence. Gathered by, who's going to gather this audit evidence is the internal auditor, right, regarding this assessment of risk, etc. So the degree of subjectivity involved. So these three things, the external auditor is going to consider these three things to have an idea about the effect that the work of internal auditor is going to have on the nature, timing, and extent of the external auditor's procedures. Now we have using the work, a specific work of the internal auditor. What we have to do? See, in the objective, we were talking about whether and to what extent to use the work of internal auditor. Which work? The specific work. Now, the same thing we are going to discuss over here, using the specific work of internal auditor. What the auditor has to do when he is using the specific work of the internal auditor. He shall perform audit procedure. He has to evaluate the audit procedures. Why? Because to determine the adequacy of this work for the external auditors purposes. So and this is again something which is going to be documented, or these audit procedures which we are performing on this the internal auditor's work is what we are going to document. So to use specific work of internal auditor, the external auditor shall evaluate and perform. AP refers to audit procedures on that work. Which work? The work which has already been performed by the internal auditor. We are going to evaluate and perform audit procedures on that particular work which has been done by the internal auditor. Now, why we are doing this? To determine its adequacy. Now, this thing is what we are going to document. D means document. The audit procedures which we have performed is going to be documented at the end of this essay to determine its adequacy for the purpose of external auditor. Right? We're going to perform audit procedures on the work of internal auditor. Now, to determine the adequacy, now what kind of audit procedures we are coming to? So, to determine the adequacy of specific work performed by the internal auditor for the by the internal auditor for the external auditor's purpose, the work has been performed by internal auditor, and we are determining the adequacy of this work. Sorry, the work has been performed by internal auditor, and we are determining adequacy of specific work. And why we are determining? For the external auditor's purpose. The external auditor shall evaluate these 5 things: whether the work was performed by internal auditor who is having internal auditor is having adequate technical training, that is, the internal auditor is having adequate technical training, who is performing those work. The work has been performed by internal auditor, and this internal auditor, whether he is having adequate technical training or not. So by this way we can determine the adequacy of this work. Then whether the work was properly supervised, it has to be properly supervised, it has to be reviewed and even documented. We're going to see whether the work, whether it's going to be with all these 5 things: whether the work was properly supervised, reviewed and documented. Right. Then adequate auditor, whether adequate audit evidence was obtained. Now, why we are doing this? To enable the internal auditor to draw reasonable conclusion, to enable the internal auditor to maybe draw reasonable conclusions. Now, whether the conclusions reached, see these things, whether these conclusions have been reached in appropriate, are appropriate and in circumstances, and any reports which have been prepared by the internal auditor are consistent with the results of the work performed. These conclusions reached are appropriate in the circumstances which are prevailing. Then any exception or unusual matter disclosed by the internal auditor has been resolved. There are some small points which the external auditor has to evaluate. These 5 things. If he has evaluated and the answer is favorable, then we can say that the specific work is adequate. Now, coming on to the documentation part, that is what we are going to document. I've already told you about this. The first thing which we had to document was the adequacy. So the external auditor shall document conclusions regarding the evaluation of adequacy of the work. He would have reached some conclusion, say, whether the work of internal auditor is likely to be adequate or not. So he did these 4 things. He examined the objectivity, evaluated technical competence, and if the results was favorable, for example, he would have concluded that the work is adequate. So we have to document this thing, that he should document the conclusions regarding the this evaluation of adequacy. So the first thing which he has to document is conclusions regarding the evaluation of adequacy of the work of internal auditor. Now, over here we are performing some audit procedures. He shall evaluate and perform audit procedures on that work. Which work? the internal audit, the work which has been performed by the internal auditor to determine the adequacy. So we have already determined the adequacy and documented this, whether it is adequate or not. Now we are going to document the audit procedures which we have performed. So second thing which we are going to document, and the last thing of this essay, is that the audit procedure, AP refers to audit procedures performed. And who is going to perform this audit procedure? Not the internal auditor, but the external auditor, performed by the external auditor. So audit procedure performed by the external auditor on this work, on adequacy of the work of internal auditor. So we can say on that work. Right. Conclusions regarding the evaluation of adequacy of the work of internal auditor and the audit procedures performed by the external auditor on that work. Right. This was all for the essay 610, and my next video is going to be regarding essay 620. Hopefully you like this and would like that as well. You may subscribe my channel and like the video. Thank you so much.